Hello. Good evening. Welcome to Cooper Gallery. My name is Sophia Yadong Hao, and I'm a director and the principal curator of Cooper Gallery at the University of Dundee. So I'm absolutely delighted to see so many of our friends, colleagues, and the audience gathered together here this evening to celebrate the opening of Cooper Gallery's first exhibition in 2026, the Debtor's Portal, by Iranian artist, filmmaker, and writer Bahar Noorizadeh. Welcome, Bahar, to Cooper Gallery and to Scotland. I'm also thrilled to be joined by one of the most distinctive and critically inspiring artist collective active across continents, within and out with the art world today. Kodwo, Eshun, and Anjalika Sagar of the Otolith Group, also co-directors of the Otolith Collective, who have worked closely with myself and the Cooper Gallery team to co-curate and produce this exhibition. So we have a very packed schedule this evening, and I know many of you are eager to hear from Bahar, Kodwo, and Anjali, and to explore Bahar's work in this exhibition. So I will refrain from reading out their biographies. They are published in the handouts on your seats and also on our website. So instead, I would like to share a few thoughts, which I hope will sketch some concerns, intentions, and aspirations motivate both Bahar, the Otolith Collective, and of course, the Cooper Gallery. So before I start, I would like to take this opportunity to express my heartfelt gratitude to our funders, Creative Scotland and the Duncan Jordanstone College of Art Centenary Fund, without whom this project would not have happened. I also wish to extend my deep appreciation to my colleagues at the Cooper Gallery and the Duncan Jordanstone for their hard work and unwavering dedication throughout a very, very challenging period of time for us all. Last but not least, I should also thank my co-curators, the Otolith Collective, sitting next to me, and Hannah in the audience, for their, and of course, Bahar, the artist, for their creative and the critical insights, but most of all, for their friendship, trust, and the generosity throughout this collaboration. So I'm always inspired by the critical propositions and the stimulating operations of my dear friends, Anjali, Kodwo, and Hannah of the Otolith Collective. And to me, the best articulation of their practice has to be this incisive paragraph by the art critic Ed Helter, who wrote in Art Forum in 2023, and I quote, "The Otolith Group may be in the art world, but they are not of it. Their greatest strategy is the re-instrumentalization of this art world as a base for a 21st century communication network. Sagar and Eshun hijack art world structures to serve not the need of investment capital and individual egos, but rather the global circulation of radical ideas." End of quote. So instrumental to the circulation of radical ideas is a precious ability to imagine alternative modes of social organization, and more importantly, to reveal how economic systems shape lived experience. And Bahar's work, through its immersive and sensorial aesthetic power, absolutely expands our perception on both counts, by offering an acute insight into what lurks beyond the veil of neoliberal capitalism. So over the past 12 months developing this project with Bahar and the Otolith Collective, we have, as everyone else has, collectively witnessed ongoing genocide, the proliferation of the humanitarian crisis, totalitarian tyrannies tightening their grips, and the horrors of too many brutal wars. Making sense of the role of art in this extremely dark moment is not an easy task, but crucial to the necessity of doing so is a firm commitment to criticality in art and culture, and to take a stand against a pervasive anti-intellectualism creeping through the art world. Both Bahar and the Otolith Collective share this commitment to the nuanced intellectual rigor and the necessity for self-organized communities of inquiry. So with these thoughts in mind, I cannot help but be reminded by the late cultural theorist and the music critic Mark Fisher, who was a much-loved friend of Kodwo and Anjalika. I feel it's more than appropriate to share these words from Mark in this very time space. In his seminal work, Capitalist Realism, Is There an Alternative? Or Is There No Alternative? Mark argued for the necessity of breaking the nothing can happen myth. And I'll quote, "The long dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capital realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the grey curtain of reaction which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again." So with Mark's always timely words, so I shall give the floor to Bahar, Anjalika, and Kodwo. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Gosh, that was a beautiful introduction. Thank you for that. Beautiful and poignant and moving. So thank you for that. It's really a great honor and a great pleasure, I must say, to be here again, here at the Cooper Gallery, which for us is one of the most important spaces in the UK in relation to this, as Ed describes, a communication network, a network of solidarity in different ways, a particular attention to practices that we're all committed to. And so, yes, it's a great pleasure to be here with you again, and also with you know, the warmth that this organization brings to, I think, us when we were last here, but again, and thank you to Peter, Ruda, and all the team here for your warmth and your incredible welcome, and the detail by which you do everything here is really unbelievable and great and precise, and unlike any institution I've actually been in the UK. Good evening. Welcome to the Weird Ecologies of Art. I again want to say it's a great honor to be here on this platform with my sister, Sophia, my sister Bahar, my long-term collaborator and partner in crime, Kodwo, and Hannah Liley, who's here in the audience. So today we're going to talk with the artist, theorist, and friend, and co-thinker, co-conspirator, Bahar Noorizadeh, about her new and existing artworks installed at Cooper Gallery, her exhibition titled The Debtor's Portal. We worked with Bahar already on her exhibition, Free to Choose at FACT in Liverpool last year, and we've conducted a number of talks as well as part of this touring exhibition, I would say. with Quinn Slobodian, the writer. One of his books, Crack Up Capitalism, is in that room over there, and Melinda Cooper. Also a theorist whose work, essay, is one of her important essays that's been very influential, is also next door. So this has been a kind of project which has been developing for a while, so it's amazing to see it here, so beautifully installed and given the kind of space and breadth it needs here at Cooper Gallery. So, but between Facts in Liverpool last year and now, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, not to mention ongoing genocides and barbarity, forms of barbarity in places like Sudan and Congo, the massacres by the state in response to the legitimation crisis in Iran, and the implications of the 3 million partially redacted Epstein files released by the Department of Justice in the US inform and unveil the monstrosity of the moment in which we think and make work and think about the work we make. Indeed, get up in the morning.
So all of this requires theory, which is both insufficient and essential. We do not have the luxury of anti-theoretical arguments, nor can we entertain the illusions and the delusions of anti-intellectualism. If we are to survive and to combat the late fascisms, the disaster nationalisms, the neo-feudalisms, the techno-feudalisms, and the psycho-Zionisms within which we are enmeshed. So we're going to talk for, it was 40 minutes, now it's 35 minutes. We're going to talk for 40 minutes, and then we're going to go to questions for Bahar. We have time for a couple of questions for about 10 minutes. So I'm going to kick things off. So when you enter the ground floor of Cooper Gallery, we're confronted by the game engine aesthetics of Teslaism.
It's covering the mic, yeah.
Of Teslaism.
It's better.
Economics after the end of the future, from 2022. So we see an avatar of Elon Musk running through a depopulated gamescape, alongside, in front and behind of a self-driving Tesla car. And in the middle, that's in the middle of the frame. And what we hear are the continued rhythmic melodies, the rhythm melodies of Detroit techno, which cast a spell upon us as we listen and as we watch. So maybe as a way into Teslaism and into the entire exhibition, maybe could you talk a bit about that move into animation, into working with game engines, and how, and what that affords you, what that afforded you back in 2022 and subsequently. We could understand Teslaism as a speculation on the relations between the future of techno as electronic music, the future of technology as in the self-driving car, and the future of the idea of the future itself under contemporary techno-feudal capitalism. So can you talk a bit about that move into the game engine and what it allows and what it enabled for you? Thank you.
Thank you to everyone on this panel, and with much less elegant words, I have to first say how grateful I am to all of you. This is really the best presentation of these works so far. Huge thanks to Peter, Rona, Dan, Zoe, Josie, Louis, everyone at the office, and of course, speaking of this global network, this is really the best conditions for these works to be in conversation with people like yourself. And I hope this becomes an expanded conversation, because we don't time things in this short-term manner that's most kind of engagements these days function in. So really, I feel this moment is just one kind of crystallization of a certain set of ideas with these interlocutors, hopefully for more future kind of engagement. And I'm just gonna go to your question on Teslaism. I really love the architecture of Cooper. I feel like brought out something, added a different dimension to the works that I wasn't envisioning it even on paper when we were thinking about the idea of Debtor's portal. But the portal kind of manifested in various ways. I guess throughout this conversation, we keep coming back to how walking through the show kind of creates this sort of portal. And maybe Teslaism, in a way, is a prelude to enter this world. As you see, like, there's this figure running at the center of the screen into the depth of, into the depth of that 3D space. And spatially, this is one of the first kind of like places where I encountered that kind of like, inter kind of like operation of gamification and gaming in our current kind of economies, and the temporality of finance and the temporality of like current mode of capitalism. Like, it's the same way we function on our phones, like the idea of the doom scroll, the way we kind of like, give into the procrastination of the attention economy. But also gaming seems like a more innocent figure in this like, late stage of capitalism, but when you come to think of it like from the conspiratorial kind of like realm that's created, that becomes real after the Epstein files. That boundary of like the game and the reality like clearly has been broken. So it really needs like a re-envisioning of how do we create these critical boundaries again after all these conspiracies have become real. So thinking through the game for me is also thinking through that dialectical space of, the kind of the vagueness of reality and, and play is completely broken. And some people are in charge of the game, are in charge of the plays. And yeah, as artists, we do like to think we have, power to counter that, but it needs like kind of thinking through the question of the political economy of art and our practices to come up with like what kind of games can gain traction, how do we gain traction. There needs to be an infrastructure behind the game. So I'm kind of like going maybe in a more theoretical direction with talking about Teslaism. But Teslaism was an idea to that was kind of, it was developed as a footnote in the kind of in the body of my PhD thesis to try to conceptualize what comes after post-Fordism, this term that describes like, the neoliberal stage of capitalism in terms of production. And Teslaism is a moment where fictions make cars, make industry, make industry dynamic, mobilizes, production. So it's not just Elon Musk tweets. It's like tweets as kind of the engine, literally like cars that can make markets move, etc. But at the same time, like we talk about this later, we want to also break this idea of the novelty of this moment. So there is a prehistory to the working of these fictions that are now so prevalent and widespread.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I mean, just quickly on your point about conspiracy, I mean, it's the techno-feudalists, what did we think they were getting up to? They learnt from imperialists who were always performing barbaric perversity. Perversity and barbarism and this is just a kind of a form of it, this is the form of it that's now at war with civilians everywhere. So it's, the conspiracy is a kind of, as Clara Zetkin says, a term, I think, something that has emerged due to a political homelessness, sort of. But I think for those of us who've always known what they've done, to see it happening now, of course, it's completely depressing, but we were warning people, many of us were warning people for a long time, and the art world and many other so-called, you know, people who we thought we were in solidarity with had no interest in these, you know, these politics. But anyway, we're going to move on to the next work, because as we, and we can come back to maybe these points later, but because of time, I want to go to the next work. So as we exit the ground floor, we approach the staircase at the top of which we can see a 4.3 screen of CGI silent depopulated terraqueous marsh landscape with a sinister LA Vegas style sign that welcomes you to a fabulous X-world. And this new work, Welcome to the Fabulous You from 2006. This is a new work, Welcome to the Fabulous You from 2006. And then as you walk up the stairs, the first work you see is an oval screen in which we see the 3D scene of a floating biomorphic city of Hong Kong of the future. The year is 2046, in front of which we can see the suspended parts of a 3D printed car. And this is a work called The Space of Flows, which is a pilot for Free to Choose, this work here. The epic science fiction opera that we can see in this space later. Can you talk of the dialogue between this new work, Welcome to the Fabulous You, and the older work, The Space Flows from 2001 and Free to Choose from 2023?
Yeah, so I guess in the same manner as this portal found itself, kind of like shaped itself in the space of the gallery, I feel something, like now that I see the work, I feel something that happened was Teslaism was very much hallucinated in the making, so there was no script. The script was being written while I was playing with this game engine. So some of the prompts for the narrative seem like, you know, they shift throughout the story. So, you know, he's going somewhere, he's going to this shareholder meeting, suddenly he's going to the shareholder after party. There's a dreamlike logic to this. And then as you walk up the stairs and you see this piece, Welcome to the Fabulous You, in a way, like, you know, the spaces are kind of being hallucinated. It's the same landscape that's used in the piece Reuter in Tehran and Teslaism, which I was just talking to some people. It was bought on Unreal Marketplace. So it's a recycled landscape, basically. And the landscape kind of like changes function from this, you know, what's called the post-gamified Berlin dystopia to now the south of Iran in this kind of future or speculative moment where it has turned into this tourist zone for the 0.01% global rich. And this tourist industry is now kind of operating under the company X, which is former Twitter. So it's the Tesla word from downstairs that's kind of now, you know, reconfigured as the X word and repurposed for this new work called Reuter in Tehran, which we'll get to. It's in the study space on the left. And the work called Space of Flows, it's kind of like tracking, you know, this figure of the car. As you see, the car is, you know, has a kind of like spectral presence in all the pieces. It's what drives, like, you know, through the portal. And in Free to Choose, the car kind of travels through this time tunnel. That was one of the first kind of like editions of thinking about, you know, the the kind of like, this temporality of the car that basically narrates like economic history in a sense, from early 20th century till now. But also, as I was saying today to multiple people, it's the worst design, it's the worst kind of design project in the history of design, as this individualistic kind of like object that we keep trying to fix and reform and make green and make electric and extract and feed and like so it speaks to like many dimensions of what we're discussing.
Yeah, thank you, Bahar. So in a way, each work functions as a portal, and in a way, clearly the exhibition space itself functions as a portal that delivers you into those portals. We can think of the mirrors in this space, the 5 mirrors on each side, these suspended structures which turn this space into a kind of multiple chamber of mirrored entrances and exits. So in a way, there's a sense of using the exhibition space to switch on its capacity to act as a portal, which is a threshold, what Mark Fisher called an egress. So it's a threshold across which you exit and you enter. So we cross into the space of the film, but something is crossing into this world. Something from the worlds of the works are entering into our world. And this is what a portal is. It's the space between worlds. And that relates to, I think each of your works have that question. And that's because under capitalism, capitalism functions to mutate subjectivity, to mutate objects. I think this is one of your grand preoccupations, to find a form that is equal to the mutation of subjectivity, a form that is as mutant as capitalism itself is. And so bearing in mind that question of mutation and mutant forms which capture really existing mutations, if we hold that thought in mind, so as we come up the stairs, past the set of works that you just described for us, we come to a new body of work, a work in process, which you called Reuter in Tehran. And so that's the name for an ongoing research which will emerge in a new film that Bahar is working on. And before that, there's going to be a collaborative performance here at Cooper Gallery with the producer in TV, Saturday 11th, so make sure you come along to that. So part of what we see in that new constellation of works, we see a timeline, it's printed in tracing paper, and that situates the process of neoliberalism in Iran within a longer colonial continuum, the formation of the imperial bank in Persia, and then that within the much longer duration of value making in what was known as Persia. And then we can see a map that brings together what Bahar calls financial agents, wind agents, and most enigmatically and compellingly metamorphic geofictional entities. There's a map that functions as a cartography that draws out the relations between those figures. And then behind that, there's a projection called X-World, which the work on the wall at the top of the stairs refers to. And when you look at that work, you can see a floating text, an enigmatic sign in silver and bronze capital letters. Behind that's a 3D color mapping of scenes from Koyaanisqatsi, the famous film from the 80s. And there's a text that we can read, a text which seems to double and to shimmer and to fold and to collapse and to remake itself before our eyes. And it says these words: what is behind money? All of history. What is behind money? All of history. That's a quotation from the Cambridge economist Joan Robinson. And in a way, we can use Joan Robinson's words as a probe into these works. So I'm not asking you to reconstruct the entire research process, which is still underway. It's still transforming, you're still undertaking it. It's more a question about ways you decide to fabricate that research that you're embarked on, the way you animate that work through those decisions, the sensorial decisions, the affective decisions. And in a way, it's a larger question about, how you transpose the theory that you're engaged in reading, the history that you're working with, into combinations of signification, sensation, and affect. And so that particular constellation is a powerful hit of all of those things at once. So could you talk about any aspect of that work of transposition?
Thanks, Kodwo. That was really a brilliant description of the piece. It's a work in progress, what you see in the study room, therefore it's an object of study. As you see, there's a timeline that tries to linearize this very sprawling map that not only goes back to this long durée of money, but also the kind of the geological scale and the role of like all different kind of like variations of this colonial like continuum, which we know more about from this perspective about the transatlantic slave trade and how that formalized the regime of finance in the West and brought about kind of banking as kind of institutionalization of finance, finance as a promise on the future. So this is what the work is tracking, like this history of like, money as the promise on the future, which is not linked to kind of coinage and material money, but there was, at its base, there was something immaterial about this relationship. But then it shifts its lens also to the Indian slave trade and how these practices kind of, formed certain relationships in the Gulf, in the south of Iran, in Persia. So it's going in many different directions. So the timeline is an attempt to bring about kind of these different dynamics together. But I'm also thinking about what you said on kind of like history of mutation. I think in a way also the attempt of the work is to, is the question of how to think about history through this optics of money. So kind of like money itself as an agent that allows us to expand our scope of the problems that we're detecting now in the kind of like contemporary state of crisis, and to be more kind of like concrete, because this research for me started with one chapter that was called Hayek in Iran. You see in the map on the left, the diagram on the left, and it's dated at 1979, like when the Iranian Revolution happened. And I was trying to think about neoliberalism in the past 50 years in Iran, which is a very undermined topic, like the way that Iran is usually received as this kind of, in these ideological debates. My interest in political economy kind of like drove me to think about how like certain practices that we ascribe to like Western states were very much like grounded in the first years of the current state, and it kind of culminated in the crisis that we saw like unfolded in the past month or two. But then again, like after that first chapter, I realized I can't start my kind of the clock at that point. I need to go back, I need to go further back. You can always go further back, but this time I think to start with the origins of banking is the moment that we can kind of like try to understand the institutionalization of these regimes of finance. And so maybe partly this is kind of a quirky story that is embedded in the research. The first bank in Iran, the Imperial Bank of Persia, which was established in 1880s, was a concession to Baron Reuter from the Reuter Agency as a kind of basically a reparation for an earlier concession 20 years before that, which gave away the entire rights to mining, roads, railroads, all sorts of resources, oil exploration, and banking to like the private person of Baron Reuter 20 years prior to that. So the bank was kind of a payment for for his like early payments that was canceled due to like mass protests. But the bank becomes kind of this figure that infiltrates, you know, that region, and I kind of like fictionalized it as like, you know, the moment where a virus spread kind of takes shape through this banking system, and I try to trace that as a kind of fictional financial detective investigator to the present. And that's going to be part of the performance that's here in April 11th. Yeah.
Last day of the exhibition.
With the Scottish Yemeni musician Intibent. So there's a play written around these characters.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about the car as a kind of prosthesis, and then to kind of move into the bank as a kind of other kind of embodiment of, and a kind of extension in relation, when you think about films like Christine from '83 by John Carpenter, the film about this kind of car which takes control of everyone and everything. One of my favorite films, I'm obsessed with cars. Or Duel from '71 by Steven Spielberg, or, you know, Cronenberg's film Crash, where the car kind of, you know, becomes like this extension of the body and sort of produces these kind of psychic horrors and forms of kind of more than human control. I think it's, yeah, and then there's the new film with Tom Hardy, I think, where he's trying to drive along in his car on the way back from somewhere, and his wife is talking through the speakers, I think. Can't remember, but the wife and the car and his isolation inside this machine, you know. I think the 70s and 80s kind of had this more kind of open space where the car becomes actually the kind of horror that you have to deal with and confront. And that becomes part of you and produces desire and sexuality and kind of psychic possibility. But interestingly, when it comes to the bank, I think to think about how the bank becomes like part of our kind of normalized reality, which kind of makes sense in relation to how culture is being deadened by, I mean, what is a bank? At least a car gets you somewhere, a bank just destroys you. So it's like, you know, this bank as a prosthesis is like just flattening everything into beige, and 1%ers going on kind of frontier settler holidays. But that brings, just that aside, it brings us to the study area, which is here, which is a crucial aspects of this exhibition, and I think of Cooper Gallery in the kind of continuous experiment of a study area. So not only do you bring the text that you think with for your works, but you also bring the text that informed your doctoral research and your doctorate is there, such as Kodwo Eshun's seminal book, More Brilliant Than the Sun, from '95, I think it is. Mark Fisher's Weird and Eerie, The Weird and the Eerie. William Gibson is there. Marina Vishmit's Influential Speculation as Mode of Production, Forms of Value, Subjectivity in Art and Capital, from the late and the late dear Marina Vishnich from book from 2018, who was a friend, close friend and ally of the Cooper Gallery and a friend of ours, as well as the diagrams that relate to your doctoral thesis, Weirder Than Sci-Fi, Speculative Practice in Art and Finance, which is also in the study area. You open up this amazing project, the Weird Economies platform, that you initiated in parallel with and after your research, which acted for 4 years as a self-sustaining interpretive community that extended and socialized your research and gave platform to a number of other researchers. So can you talk about the idea and the practice of Weird Economies as a platform and self-organizing community, which many artists here are working with in relation to rethinking how we actually, as a matter of urgency, have to rethink ourselves out of individuation into complex economies and thinking spaces of sustainability that allow for, let's say, more expansive forms of collective living and organizing ourselves for the future, and which you know, we are trying to give space to as Otolith Group in terms of thinking of collectivity, as does the Cooper Gallery. So how important is this as an aspect in your work in the face of the critique and also the disinterest from major institutions?
So this cluster of work in this exhibition really marks kind of a shift in my practice, which I would describe. It's going in the direction of trying to think about a politics of the speculative age. Like if we diagnose this moment we're at in terms of how the future is occupied by, by this like asymmetrical power. First a diagnosis and then, how to come up with a politics to counter it. And Weird Economies was sort of a research expose at first. Like when I started the PhD, I realized I can't do this work alone, as we were talking about all types of research-based practices. Like there's a delusion of like, solo individual practice in that sense. Like you need a body of people to think with you. So it first kind of like formed as this directory and kind of like archival ground, as well as an active kind of site for experimentation around what could be a politics for this speculative time, like working with artists, researchers, writers, thinkers, scientists, people who were kind of like experimenting with alternative economies, and kind of trying to expand our idea of what kind of art is in that sense. Like how do we account for creativity when we think from this perspective? So yeah, that's kind of the work that Weird Economies has been doing. And it also tried to establish itself in certain sites. So we had different chapters, like in the past few years, like the Financescapes projects, Financescape Brazil, Financescape Portugal, Lisbon, Palestine, Iran, most recently, where we kind of like curated certain programs with invited guests and invited curators to plan a series of kind of activities on the ground to try to kind of like grasp at these dynamics that are both shared. There's a shared logic to capitalism worldwide, but also what's the particular kind of like, instantiations and how they show up in these locations. So this was the work that we've been doing in the past year or two, going from online to on-site. That's the project, Weird Economies. And as Anjali said, like there's a lot of writing here that it kind of like excites me. Like I wish This was my library at home. Yeah, you could probably spend hours with these texts. Like they really get deep into like this 40-minute conversation we're having here. They open a portal to like another world of study.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe to open things up.
Yeah, I think we have time for a couple of questions, but I just wanted to also quickly say that the relationship to the operatic and the opera in relation to this work, that you collaborated with the Waste Paper Opera, Clara Cofen, and others on this incredible work, on this incredible opera for me, which is important for us because, you know, I think the opera has always been a delivery system with the libretto for all kinds of political kind of, you know, agendas, you know, on all fronts. There has been this kind of, you know, grand, you know, performance of multiple forms of vocality, and of course the politics of vocality and polyphony are important there because, you know, polyphony is a kind of threat to the state as such. So, I mean, I think the relationship to this Baroque form of, I mean, the Waste Paper Opera are committed to the kind of politics of polyphony, I would say, in their work. But what drew you to the operatic, just very quickly? Maybe you could hold that, and then we could open it to the two questions only.
Yeah, maybe very briefly, because it speaks to like another question that I feel I didn't fully answer on the affective. This was really the conversation between me and Clara coming from, you know, the space of experimental opera, also being kind of a researcher of French Revolution, and thinking about the question of revolution, capitalism, and affects, and how affects organize themselves between this kind of two poles of like revolution and capitalist sentiments. And for both of us, like, you know, both finance and opera are a way of kind of like, you know, experiencing the surplus, the kind of, the overwhelm. Again, like to extend the timeline of finance from like the past 50 years to the past few centuries, you can really kind of like, you know, trace back this dynamics to a different time. So that was really the relationship that we felt, and we kind of continued on with different works after Free to Choose.
I think actually on that note, it's a perfect moment for us to listen to the last track, Otolith Collective selected for this evening. And I also want to refer back to Mark Fisher again, because Mark was instrumental to create this cluster of time and space for collective being together and listening. I think this is the very moment for us to experience that again. Okay, I would like to thank the Otolith Collective again for this and Bahar for such a stimulating and thought-provoking in conversation, but also for curating all these wonderful tracks for this evening. That's really special. And that was such a contemplative soundscape, actually, for reflections. I think after that 5 minutes, maybe there's some responses and questions for our speakers tonight. But because of the time we have is really limited, perhaps we have a couple.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting, and I'm so glad I came along tonight. As you were talking, and as we were thinking and listening and reflecting just there, as someone with a Christian background, sort of went through my head was where they say the root of all evil is the love of money. And it got me thinking about banks and about cars And I just wonder whether there might be a utopian world where cars and banks serve as functions rather than axes of power, and what that might look like in terms of envisioning that, because I know that a lot of your work was envisioning how that things might progress in the future. So just interested to hear your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Other than I realise I've just thrown it at you. So.
Microbanking.
Huh?
Microbanking.
What about microbanking? Go ahead. Yeah, I guess like what's the kind of perspective on the future? I feel these series of works are really trying to kind of start from that place of nihilism to think about the otherness from that perspective versus what I said, like, because I feel the projects of reforming the car are already present in all shapes and forms and like, in the present. And that's pretty much like the entire kind of, EU, like, at least like in Europe, like the European policy is completely shaped by kind of the drive towards like recycling, greenness, mandates, expanding EV. So I'm just talking about the car now. I'm not entirely sure, that will provide like a satisfactory situation, especially from this kind of vantage point we're at, with the kind of what some people describe as the polycrisis, and especially the polycrisis that's already kind of, annihilated the future for most of the planet. So we're already at the end of the future in certain continents and regions. I mean, the Iran case for me is like now very dire, for example. In terms of banking, I think there were also some attempts, for example, with blockchain technologies to think about how that can be combined with, in a kind of a progressive form with banking. We're talking about the book Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, where he's like that was written during COVID, and he was trying to think of a kind of using like blockchain technology to incentivize like carbon-free futures, but also link it to kind of statewide scales through banking as a kind of proposition. But I think he also let go of that idea after a few years. He said he doesn't believe in it anymore. I think as a technology, like it could be useful to think about pairing it with other techniques, but like I think it's also very much in line with what Kim Stanley Robinson thinks of the best case possible kind of like scenario for the future, not like the satisfactory future, but maybe on that level we can think about repurposing some of this. But I feel like still it doesn't address the fact that like this future is already ended for, elsewhere.
And I mean, there's many kinds of banks. There's seed banks. There's all kinds of things that are being collected and preserved in this kind of crisis. But I'm interested in, I don't know enough about it, but the Grameen Bank, or Muhammad Yunus, who's the sitting Prime Minister of Bangladesh, so he was, they got rid of that corrupt Sheikh Hasini, and he has become the sitting Prime Minister. I'm not sure what's happened recently, but his whole thing was on the Grameen Bank and microbanking, which I don't know enough about, but kind of I think something along those lines of kind of a collectivized sort of form of community-based distribution and exchange has to be linked with sustainability, and I don't know. A world post money is something that I think is the only way to return us to any kind of form of trust between humans. You know, otherwise there's no social fabric whatsoever. But anyway.
Are there any more responses or questions in the audience?
I won't hog it if somebody else wants to ask a question. I think the future of cars is no cars and is fully accessible, free public transport instead, but that's just my personal passion. I just wanted to ask about the future of banking. It just got me thinking about, and I don't know much about it, but like the Islamic practice of, you know, not charging, not paying any interest, and I'm wondering whether that is something that we should be looking at as a sort of anti-growth strategy.
So, I mean, maybe a quick response to that. I'm also not like an economic expert, but I just had like a good chunk of studies in economic theory. But this is already something in practice. For example, in the Gulf, in Dubai, Saudi, like they have a parallel system of Islamic banking at the same time as foreign banking. But Islamic banking, or basically the kind of non-usury kind of like banking, they find loopholes to justify usury, because you can't survive in this economy if you don't, you know, don't like take interest on loans. So it's facing the kind of like scale of that. Like all of these like kind of practices have been already corrupted by the growth kind of principle. Part of Reuters in Iran is actually looking at the kind of resistance movements to foreign banking. But also when you come to the contemporary moments, like, you know, with the revolution in Iran, one thing that happened was the first, one of the first kind of policies of the state was to dismantle private banks and form one national bank, which just within a few years, it turned into this super corrupt kind of like parallel system of finance. So this is really what I was looking at this kind of like formation of the parallel kind of religious slash non-state kind of like supervised financial system that had a hold on like 80% of the GDP till the present, which includes also the IRGC, the Guardian Corps, besides like, you know, what's the official kind of like banking system. So in this kind of like climate, all sorts of resistance kind of like give in to a worse form of extraction in other names and shapes.
Thank you. Oh, there's another one.
Hi, thanks so much. My question is very simple. I think it's been so delightful to hear you all speak tonight. And I think you started by saying that this space mattered and made you think. And we're all interested at the moment in education for our younger people and spaces for critical thinking. And I just wanted to ask all of you what it means to kind of, and particularly you, what it means to kind of present your ideas, your thoughts in a kind of an academic context where people are coming to learn and share and think about things, and why that matters even more now, I think. So an open kind of question.
Maybe I can just quickly say, I actually think it's a responsibility of the public bodies to distribute information and intellectual intellect, great intellects mediated through public television. At least I'm just maybe being a bit nostalgic, but I grew up with Stuart Hall on television. I grew up when Pasolini would be on television. I grew up with experimental television. It was Channel 4 in that time was incredible. BBC Two had Open University. So you know, it was you know, it's the responsibility of the state. At that time there was a GLC, I guess. So you know, there was you know, an anti-racist movement putting, you know, people's work who were part of movements onto these public platforms. Within, you know, Channel 4 supported a number of different collectives, miners collectives, Black and Asian film collectives, some of which are quite well known, etc. There was all kinds of things going on. The point is, there was a kind of space, post-war kind of space, for people to deal with colonialism, inequality, all of these different things, because people had safe housing, there was a good welfare state. At least I grew up inside all of that. So of course now everything just feels like it's gone completely and totally backwards, and we're all having to fight for the space to think about critical thinking, analyzing what's going on, what the hell is going on, having to fight against the forms of silencing that are going on, the anti-intellectualism that has always been very British, you know. Speaking on behalf of the so-called working class, you know, the public school boys who run the Sun tell us, you know, we are, you know, being too complicated. You know, that's a really old, like, story here in this country. So we're not fooled, you know. But I think it's important, I mean, for everybody to try and create within their own social circles, reading groups, or you know, spaces to think more. You know, get Melinda Cooper, or you know, sit with Melinda Cooper, or that book Crack Up Capitalism, or I don't know, Mark Fisher, or Kodwo's book, or you know. Instead of watching some Netflix bullshit where you just see women being killed all the time. I mean, that's a hyperstition now. We know they're all doing it. But, you know, why not organize a reading group? I suspect people would feel a bit embarrassed about, like, oh, that's too serious, that's too intellectual, or that's, you know, that whole thing one has to just dispense with, get rid of it, and enjoy thinking together. I mean, that would be my, I mean, I say that to myself, you know, like, you know.
That's really important, and that's the very spirit of why we are together, actually, right now. And all these programs kind of delivered and produced through Weird Economies and through Otolith groups. You know, if I think some of you perhaps participated in some of those events, and you know, thinking critically and together, that whole series of events we produced at Cooper Gallery, and also the forthcoming events program through Debtor's portal. I think that those small clusters of thinking together, being together, I think that's perhaps, you know, the starting point for resistance. I think that's very important, and all of us should learn from thinking together and being together. I think that's perhaps...
Maybe, can I say something quickly?
Yes,
I think this is really a crucial point, because I really, like, it's something that I feel for greatly these days, especially with the rise of fascism worldwide and in its different shapes, you know, in different settings, different countries, states, regions. It feels like the form that fascism manifests itself is in this demand for urgency and urgent responses and quick fixes and coming up with the most immediate response to the crisis that everybody's feeling, including the base of the base that they kind of like uphold. And this is where I feel like it's really a war on, in the situation we're at, like the emphasis on education, on holding the kind of the gates of like thinking open is, it's becoming more and more impossible. And it's becoming kind of like physically almost dangerous to be in this space of thinking. So yeah, thanks for that question. I feel it's like the best way to close this.
Hold the gates of thinking open. Prize them open.
But also, I think Bahar just repeated what I said early on. It felt like a darkest moment in human history, but then we could always go back to all these wise words and thoughts from others. And I think, I want to just re-quote Mark Fisher, the last sentence from the paragraph I read earlier, from a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly everything is possible again. Let's hope. Thank you very much.